I'm just gonna say it. Sleeping with your shield isn't as cozy as it sounds. The Iron Age, aka roughly the last 1,000 years before the Middle Ages, was a rough time to be alive unless you were a Viking. Then it was a pretty great time to be alive, actually. Seafaring raiders from Scandinavia, they dominated the seas and mindshare of Europe from the 8th to 11th centuries, famous for their pillaging, exploration, and incredible longboats. But while Hollywood has romanticized them as fierce warriors, we're here to delve into the grittier details, specifically the grimy ones. Today we're answering, how did Vikings sleep? Spoiler alert, not like the stoic, solitary figures staring into fireplaces you might imagine. The reality was far more cramped, chaotic, and probably smellier. To understand Viking sleep, you gotta picture their living spaces. Most lived in longhouses, massive rectangular wooden halls. We're talking about structures up to 200 feet long, housing multiple generations of families, maybe over 100 people in one hall. Don't worry, there were plenty of other types of Viking dwellings, from simple tents to small villages, but let's focus on the longhouse. Think of these as the Victorian duplexes of the Viking world, minus plumbing, indoor running water, or electricity, and add in a few dozen goats. Longhouses were made of wood, turf, and thatch, with the biggest expense being the roof, which needed regular repair to keep out the rain. The interior was all communal. Long tables for eating and drinking, benches for storage and sleeping, and raised platforms sometimes covered with straw or furs, which were basically your beds. They weren't fancy, but they were sturdy. Well, the word sturdy depends on how many goats decided to climb aboard for a nap, too. Those platforms were also used for dining, socializing, and crafting, making for some very busy real estate. Remember, privacy was not a thing. Forget Netflix and chill. Longhouses were basically TikTok central. You couldn't escape the drama, and that was by design. Community was key. Privacy was for the birds or the squirrels or the goats. Now, I mentioned beds. Yeah, they weren't as comfy as yours. No Tempur-Pedic up here. Usually they were just piles of straw or hay. Sometimes they'd use feathers for extra cushioning, but mostly it was straw and hope. If you were wealthy, you might score a box bed with curtains for some modicum of privacy and protection from said goat herd. Also, don't forget your pillow. It was probably a bag of straw or maybe your cloak, but definitely not your shield unless you wanted neck pain. Speaking of wealth, the fancier your longhouse, the more chances you had for a private room, separate from the chaos of the main hall. But even the rich didn't have dedicated bedrooms. They just had slightly less goat-infested corners. Oh, and while we're at it, let's clear up a common misconception. Contrary to popular culture, Vikings didn't really sleep in huge bearskins or furs. Maybe the elite did, but most slept right on the wood. Good luck with that backache. And don't get me started on ventilation, or lack thereof. Longhouses had one small opening at each end for airflow. Yeah, that's it. No AC, so in the summer they'd open those entrances wide to catch any breeze. In the winter, though, they'd close them up tight to keep out the cold. That meant no fresh air. Ever. So you can imagine what the longhouse smelled like after a few weeks of cooking, goat shenanigans, and general unfresh human. Not to mention the smoke wafting in from the central fire pit. That's right, no chimneys. They cooked and kept warm over open flames, meaning the smoke stayed low to the rafters, coating the ceiling and residence in a permanent layer of grime. And don't even think about sleeping with your mouth open in this environment. As for bedtime routines, well, there wasn't much of one. When you got tired, you hit the hay, usually curled up against a wall or bench. If you were lucky, you'd have a blanket, but sharing was caring. And don't forget about your audience. Your bed was never truly private, so good luck trying to sneak in a midnight snack or reading a book. You had company. And we're not talking book club. We're talking chickens, pigs, goats, cows, your cousins twice removed, and your uncle who still swears he can speak to snakes. Longhouses were home to humans and livestock alike. The animals provided food, warmth, and companionship, but they also took up prime sleeping space. Imagine going to bed and a cow decides to snuggle in next to you. That wasn't a dairy cow. So why do you think they did that? In the end, it's amazing how Vikings survived on so little sleep and fresh air. They conquered, pillaged, and explored, fueled by coffee, curiosity, and sheer stubbornness. Next time you toss and turn, just remember, at least you're not sleeping in a Viking longhouse. Unless you are. In that case, sorry. Today, we all know that sleep is important. We need it to live. But back in the olden times, sleep was considered this almost embarrassing thing. You slept because you had no choice. Sleep was for the weak, the helpless, the little baby birdies. And you'd better not be caught sleeping unless you had good reason. In fact, some of the world's greatest leaders made a name for themselves by not sleeping. For example, Steve Jobs apparently didn't sleep much at all. He'd work all night and take Red Bulls until he could keep his eyes open, and of course he accomplished many great things. He co-founded Apple, helped develop the iPhone and iPad and Mac, but he was also not a role model when it came to healthy habits. In the modern day, we like to look at people like Elon Musk, who sleeps just 4 hours a night and works around the clock. And we want to be just like him. We admire people who don't need sleep. We like to think that if we sacrifice sleep to accomplish our goals, then we'll be successful too. Well, I'm here to tell you that those people are liars and you should stop listening to them. Throughout history, there have been plenty of warriors and rulers who achieved great things without sacrificing sleep. And today I'm going to tell you about one of the most terrifying warriors in history, Genghis Khan, and show you that he was actually really into taking care of himself. Well, at least he was towards the end of his life. The warrior's journey begins somewhere around 1162 AD in the grasslands of Mongolia. Genghis Khan's father was a chieftain, and his mother was the daughter of another chieftain. So basically everyone expected young Temujin to become a mighty conqueror, though they didn't know it yet. When Temujin was just 9 years old, his father was poisoned and the family scattered. His mom and dad raised him to be a warrior, and Temujin spent his youth learning how to ride a horse, wrestle, and shoot with a bow. According to legend, once when Temujin was just a kid, a bird swooped down and tried to eat his fish. But Temujin managed to grab the bird and wrangle it, then cooked it and ate it. Maybe that's why later he became the leader of the largest contiguous land empire in history. Now called Genghis Khan, he reunited his clan and built an army. In just a few years, he united the Mongol tribes and set his sights on conquering China. He fought alongside his sworn brothers and favorite wife, Bort, whom he married when he was just 16. And while he was successful on the battlefield, he was also becoming a father. First he had his son Joki, then his son Agadai. And just like him, both boys were born and raised to be warriors. As Genghis Khan rose to power, he faced challenges that most of us can barely imagine. He survived assassination attempts. He defended his clan against enemies. He raided towns and villages. And he led his armies across Asia, but through it all he was also raising kids. In between planning battles and burning cities, he found time to teach his sons how to ride horses, throw spears, and live in the wilderness. And even though he wasn't exactly known for being gentle and tender, he loved his sons and wanted them to be strong, brave, and smart. At this point in history, it was normal for guys to start training their sons to be warriors when they were still playing with dolls. But most of those warriors weren't busy ruling the Mongol Empire and expanding it all over Asia. Most of them didn't have to worry about plotting revenge, managing an empire, or balancing the needs of their family with the demands of their conquests. Genghis Khan did. Of course, it goes without saying that being the son of the most powerful man in the world comes with its perks. Your dad will always make sure that you have the best gear, the biggest cuts of meat, and the most loyal horse. But it also comes with a lot of pressure. Let's face it, when your dad is famous for his skills in battle, it's hard not to compare yourself to him. And when your dad is Genghis Khan, those expectations are pretty high. But despite all the privileges and pressures that came with being the Khan's son, let's face it, it was still pretty cool. Imagine having a dad who was a legendary warrior, a skilled tactician, and a charismatic leader. A dad who taught you everything he knew about fighting, horsemanship, and strategy. And even though we don't agree with Genghis Khan's methods, his skills were undeniable. He was smart, he was resourceful, and he was tough, and he passed all those traits on to his sons. But Genghis Khan wasn't just a fierce fighter. He was also a shrewd strategist, a brilliant tactician, and a visionary leader. He assembled a massive army that was unmatched in its size and ferocity. He developed innovative military techniques that allowed his forces to conquer vast swaths of territory. And he inspired his troops with his courage, charisma, and unwavering determination. His sons witnessed all of this firsthand, and they learned from the best. By watching their father in action, they developed their own leadership skills, their own strategic thinking, and their own fighting prowess. They saw how their father rallied his troops, how he made decisions on the battlefield, and how he led his armies to victory after victory. And they wanted to be just like him. Genghis Khan didn't have time to waste. He was a firm believer in the philosophy of strike first, strike hard, and strike fast. He understood that in the world of war, hesitation could mean defeat, and he expected the same from his sons. He pushed them to be decisive, to be aggressive, and to take risks. But he also taught them to be calculated, to be strategic, and to think ahead. Because being a great warrior wasn't just about brute force. It was about skill, intelligence, and preparation. Genghis Khan taught his sons the art of war, but he also taught them the art of life. He showed them how to lead, how to inspire, how to motivate. And most importantly, he taught them how to be good fathers themselves one day. Despite the bloodlust that stained his hands and the empires he crushed under his iron fist, Genghis Khan had a soft spot for his family, especially his sons. He was known to have loved his first son, Joki, more than anyone else in the world. And when Joki died tragically in 1227, the great Khan wept openly. Though the cause of his death was unknown, some believe it was the result of an attempt to increase his power, which caused him to be exiled from the empire and eventually die of exposure. Whatever the truth, the loss devastated Genghis Khan, and when his second son, Agadai, died just a year later, the great Khan mourned the loss of his dynasty. However, he pressed on, driven by a desire to leave a lasting legacy for his people. He continued to expand his empire, conquer new lands, and forge alliances with other nations. And he did all of this while making sure to spend time with his remaining sons, Ogedei, Monkey, and Tuli, teaching them the ways of the warrior, the importance of family, and the responsibility that came with being the sons of the great Khan. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, he left behind a legacy that would last for centuries. He had created the largest contiguous land empire in history and had established a dynasty that would rule much of Asia. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the example he set for his sons and the values he passed on to them. They followed in his footsteps and became powerful rulers in their own right. And they did it while balancing the demands of their empire with the needs of their family. They proved that it was possible to be a warrior and a father, a conqueror and a leader, a ruthless killer and a caring mentor. And they did it all without sacrificing sleep. Okay, fine. They sacrificed sleep, but they made time for their kids anyway. That's what matters. I'm the host of this channel. And if you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy my podcast, where we talk about interesting topics like sleep and answer listener questions. Hi, it's me. Today we'll be talking about Viking sleeping habits, from the common folk to the Jarls. And we'll start off with the Viking women because these ladies never slept in. To understand why, let's start with their day. We think of Viking women as fierce fighters, and they were, but that wasn't their only job. Viking women were basically the CEO of the household, keeping everything running smoothly. They cooked, cleaned, took care of the home, raised the kids, prepared for winter, checked stores, mended clothes, welcomed guests, and maybe spun wool while they waited for the next raid to come back with more loot to mend. So when it comes to sleep, they didn't have time for that whole beauty sleep nonsense. And when night finally fell, which was pretty late in the summer, they didn't hit the hay. They kept working. But where did they sleep? Mostly where they could find space. So usually we picture Vikings sleeping on big long ships, and it's true, they sometimes did. But more often they slept on the ground or on a platform with everyone else in the community. It was rare for anyone to have their own bed. Even high-status people like jarls and earls slept on a sleeping platform, though theirs might have been slightly larger or covered in nicer materials. As for regular folks, they probably slept right on the floor, though they might have thrown a blanket or two on the ground first. Children slept wherever they fell, sometimes on a mat, sometimes in the middle of an animal pen, sometimes halfway through eating a turnip. There was no such thing as a crib, although they did put babies down on the ground, often next to the mother, where they could keep tabs on them and nurse whenever they needed. Sharing a sleeping space with everyone in your family, friends, neighbors, livestock, and random travelers wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was actually pretty common in Europe up until the 19th century. The closer you were to others, the safer you were, especially at night. Sleeping alone meant you were easy prey for nocturnal predators, both human and animal. And it turned out the only type of predator that haunted longhouses were mosquitoes. Everyone sleeping together helped keep everyone warm, especially kids, the elderly, and the sick, because body heat equals house heat. The downside is that you couldn't really get any privacy. High-status women might have been able to claim a corner of the sleeping platform with some sort of curtain for a bit of privacy, but that doesn't mean they got peace and quiet. There were always relatives awake, doing stuff. Take, for example, Saga 1, a poem from Iceland about Egil Skallagrimsson, a famous Viking poet. He was trying to write a saga, but every time he settled in to work, his son would grab his quill and try to write too. So, Dad tried sneaking his writing into the night, but unfortunately his son apparently had night vision. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I am writing," replied Egil. "Let me try," said the boy, and he started writing too. And Egil couldn't do anything about it because this was the Viking way of life. This was the perfect recipe for insomnia. First, everyone sleeps in the same room, which means your chances of getting uninterrupted sleep are roughly zero. Add to that a total lack of privacy, meaning you can be writing, reading, praying, or arguing in the middle of the night and everyone will hear you. And don't even think about whispering because you can bet your brother has super hearing when it comes to secrets. Finally, throw in a constant stream of random visitors who need food and hospitality and whose arrival might coincide with you wanting to go to sleep. It's no wonder people looked elsewhere for some shut-eye. If you were a worker in the Viking community, your sleeping situation was probably dire. You'd be lucky to have a thin blanket or a worn-out coat to wrap in, and most likely you'd be sleeping on the cold floor. And don't think you'd get a break from the noise either. People, animals, the wind coming through the cracks in the walls, someone snoring, a goat coughing, a dog shuffling around, a cat knocking things off shelves, someone clearing their throat, a child falling off a bunk and yelling, someone tripping over your head, a mouse running across your face. If you're wondering if the last one has happened to me, yes, it has. And if you're wondering why I'm telling you this, it's because I've been researching Viking history and culture for my new book, and I found out that these guys had problems sleeping too. I thought, hey, maybe it's a modern phenomenon caused by too much screen time, not enough exercise, and weird chemicals in our pillows. But no, it turns out that if you live in a smoky, crowded room full of people and animals and random travelers, insomnia is as inevitable as broken sandals. In fact, archaeologists uncovered a burial site of a woman who died sometime between the 8th and 11th centuries AD in Denmark. Her name was Hersen, and she died at the age of 40. Researchers believe she was a slave in a Viking community. Her skeleton shows signs of scoliosis and arthritis, and she had a severe infection in her right knee. She'd probably gotten injured, but instead of giving her medical attention, the Vikings decided to kill her. Her body was buried beneath the floor of a longhouse, wrapped in a thin cloth, with nothing but a small iron knife and an axe for company. What's interesting here is that her neck had been fractured, which tells us she probably wasn't killed in a battle. Instead, researchers believe she was murdered by someone she knew, perhaps a member of her own family, and it was done slowly. They tied her hands behind her back and bent her neck until it snapped. Why? Maybe she was a rebellious teenager, a problem child, a troublemaker. Maybe she'd spoken back to her master or stolen something or tried to run away. Whatever the reason, she wasn't given a proper burial. Her bones were treated with disrespect, not because she was a slave, but because she was a problem. And in a tightly knit community, a problem child isn't just annoying, it's dangerous. For the higher-ups, sleeping was probably more complicated than it needed to be. Jarls and earls were powerful men. They held political and military power. They managed trade routes and built alliances. They also loved fancy stuff. And we know that because many of their graves contain amazing artifacts, including a massive drinking horn, pieces of eight, chess, sets of jewelry, weapons, and even board games. One earl was buried with two complete outfits, a ceremonial one and a practical one, plus extra sets of shoes and belts. Maybe he brought fashion to the afterlife, or maybe his ghost liked to dress up. What's fascinating about these burials is that the Vikings, a supposedly brutal and uncultured people, carefully buried their dead with items they'd enjoy in the afterlife. They believed in an afterlife. And they wanted their favorite leaders to be comfortable even after death. Imagine what that must have been like for the average person who could unafford proper burial goods and had to settle for, say, a chip drinking horn and a moldy cloak. As for their daytime naps, well, those were even more chaotic. Let's take the Icelandic sagas, for example. They're a collection of stories from Scandinavia written in Iceland around the 13th century. They include heroic sagas about big, bad, legendary Vikings and family sagas about everyday people. And they're full of sleep references. Characters nap in the middle of nowhere, right after they finish beating the crap out of each other, while their wounds are still fresh and pus is oozing out. They also nap anywhere and everywhere on the floor, on boats, on piles of rocks. Once they even used a dead man's body as a pillow, that's right. In one saga, Thorgest, the son of King Olaf, died from a wound he got during a fight. His friend Olaf Tryggvason carried his body home, and on the way, they sat down to rest. And Olaf couldn't help but use Thorgesti's corpse as a pillow. Was he disgusting, disrespectful, or just tired? Well, that's the thing. In sagas, everyone was sleeping, enemies, friends, heroes, villains. In fact, when peace was declared between two warring factions, they sealed it with an oath on a rock. And the narrator pointed out how convenient that rock was for taking naps. Basically, napping was part of Viking life. It didn't matter who you were or where you were, sleep was always possible. So next time your boss wakes you up from a power nap or your mom makes you leave your fort to go grocery shopping, just remember, it could have been worse. You could have been a Viking sleeping next to a goat in a smoky hall while your cousin writes poetry on your face. But in all seriousness, I think there's a lesson here about disconnecting from the outside world and just shutting off for a while. After all, the Vikings, despite being known as hardcore warriors, spent most of their time farming, trading, fishing, traveling, and living their lives. Fighting was a bonus, a distraction, a hobby. So when they returned home, they still needed downtime, a place to recharge. They just didn't have the same options we do today. No coffee shops, no retreats, no white noise machines. All they had was each other, a log fire, and the hope for a good night's sleep. I'm guessing you're not used to waking up to the sun. You wouldn't be if you spent your nights in the longhouse, a big building where everybody slept in one room. Your eyelids would open to goats browsing nearby, chickens clucking, everyone snoring in every possible position, and smoke curling from the roof. Then the longhouse floorboards creak as warriors come back from a raid. They shake off the night before, trade stories about the loot they stole, and settle in for another night in the shared space. Unless they're banished or an animal decides to make its home inside, a longhouse is pretty much your permanent address. This means sleep is a carefully calibrated dance. Try to find a spot away from the baby, the dog, and the guy who snores louder than a raven. If the longhouse isn't your home, then you're probably camping out on a Viking voyage. Sleep on a ship is rocking, rolling, cramped, and stinky. You can try finding some room near the bowsprit or the rudder, but if you don't watch your head, it could get chopped off by a rope. Plus, there's no guarantee you won't get seasick. So maybe you should just sleep on deck, except beware the squids. Evenings at sea are chill, so many Vikings pass the time telling stories, drinking mead and singing songs. But around midnight the cold starts creeping in. As the temperature drops, the party stops and the only sounds are the waves lapping against the planks, the creaking of ropes and the seagulls crying overhead. The best solution, huddle with your fellow crewmates for warmth. A little close for comfort, sure, but also potentially life-saving. Okay, let's be honest, that's just gross. Sleeping in a crowded longhouse is bad enough, but this situation takes intimacy to a whole new level. There are men everywhere, half asleep, waking up and losing control of their bladders, sharing blankets and waking up with faces inches from yours. You might get lucky and find a deserted corner, but be careful not to fall asleep while standing. In a crowded hold, you could lose your footing, crash to the floor, and knock yourself unconscious. Now you're going to wake up with a splitting headache and a mouthful of splinters. At least you won't have to worry about snoring. You'll be knocked out cold. No matter where you sleep when you're a Viking, there's a 24-hour window where you aren't safe. From the moment your eyes droop to the second they pop open again, you never really know what you're going to see, smell, or hear. In medieval Scandinavia, death stalked closer to daily life than it does today. For a Viking, death could arrive any time, whether peacefully in sleep or dramatically in battle. They faced mortality daily through burial rituals and commemorated ancestors regularly. Unlike us, they celebrated death, turning cemeteries into community spaces. While we decorate our graves, they held feasts and ceremonies on top of them. This daily engagement made sleep a dicey affair. Waking up could mean confronting death once again, either literally if someone had died overnight, or figuratively as friends and family woke for raids or departures, saying their prayers and preparing for potential mortal danger. Going to bed meant leaving yourself vulnerable until the morning. Okay, first things first, Vikings didn't use alarm clocks. No fancy buzzing, dinging, or smartphone screens lighting up their faces. Nope, none of that. Instead, the sun was their alarm clock. Yep, they woke up with the sunrise. So, if you're not a morning person, you might have been better off living back then because sleep schedules were flexible. If you wanted to catch a few extra winks, that was fine. Nobody was ticking you off for sleeping in, and if you were up late chatting or working, well, so what? Sleep whenever you needed to. Now, back then, babies were put to sleep in the same room as adults. Yeah, you heard me right, in the same room. So, if you needed to get some work done, you might be in a dimly lit room surrounded by sleeping people, including possibly a baby. And let's face it, it's not the most inspiring place to get some work done. And as if that's not strange enough, the Vikings slept while fully clothed. They didn't bother with pajamas or sleepwear. They hit the hay in their travel clothes. So imagine waking up in the middle of the night and needing to go to the bathroom. Yeah, they slept in their dirty clothes, so it wasn't exactly pleasant. I mean, who wants to share a room with smelly sleepers? Well, plenty of people, because that was just how they did things back then. Everyone slept together in huge rooms called longhouses, which could fit hundreds of people. And if you thought your high school cafeteria was loud, try sleeping in a room with everyone talking, eating, drinking, playing games, and making merry. Also, let's not forget about the animals. Yep, your bed buddies could include chickens, sheep, and goats. It was not uncommon for families to share their longhouse with livestock, so you might wake up to bleating goats or clucking chickens. The worst part, no air conditioning. Back then, they relied on natural ventilation, so in the summer months, it could get really hot. Add a few dozen people, some animals, and a lack of air conditioning, and you've got the perfect recipe for a sweaty night's sleep. Oh, and let's not forget about bedbugs. Ah, yes, the gift that keeps on giving. Bedbugs were rampant in those days, thanks to the communal sleeping arrangements and lack of basic hygiene. While we're on the subject of hygiene, let's talk about bathing. Vikings took a bath about twice a year, so they didn't exactly smell fresh. Imagine waking up in a bed shared with someone who hasn't bathed in months. Not exactly pleasant. Speaking of baths, sharing a room with others meant sharing bathroom facilities. And let's just say there wasn't much privacy. You could wake up to the sound of someone brushing their teeth, showering, or, well, doing other things. And if you thought our bathrooms were tiny now, try sharing one bathroom with hundreds of people. Let's just say it could get cramped. But wait, it gets worse. Communal toilets were outside, so you might wake up to the smell of, well, human waste. Not exactly pleasant. And if you thought our bathrooms were gross now, try using an outhouse without a door. Yeah, no privacy, no lights, and no air circulation. Fun times. But perhaps the strangest thing about Viking bathrooms was the practice of throwing things out the window. That's right. If you didn't have a bathroom, the window was your toilet. So you might wake up to the sight of cleaning the streets below. How romantic. We haven't even mentioned berserkers. Who are they? Well, they were fierce Viking warriors known for their wild appearance and ferocious fighting style. They'd go into battle wearing animal skins, swinging their axes wildly and biting their shields, and guess what? Sometimes they fell asleep during battles. Yes, you heard me right. They'd get so tired from all the fighting that they fall asleep right there in the middle of it. Imagine waking up next to a bloodied, battle-hardened berserker. Not exactly a good look. Now let's talk about snoring. Vikings slept in close quarters, so you couldn't avoid the sound of snoring. Whether it was a gentle snore or a loud, obnoxious one, you were guaranteed to hear it. And if you were the one snoring, well, you might not know it because you were asleep. This meant that sleep was a constant game of musical chairs. You'd find a spot and settle down, but soon enough you'd have to move because someone else needed to sleep or someone was snoring too loudly. Well, that's a wrap on the weirdest parts of Viking sleep. Now it's your turn. What do you think is the strangest thing about the way Vikings slept? Have you ever slept in a crowded place or woken up in the middle of the night? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. As the Viking Age gave way to medieval Christianity, what happened to the Vikings' dream beliefs? Well, for starters, they started looking elsewhere for inspiration. See, when Christianity took root in Scandinavia, the Old Norse pantheon got shuffled out of the cosmic lineup. Gods like Odin and Thor, along with the whole 9 yards, took a back seat to the Virgin Mary and other assorted saints. But dreams were still a hot ticket. After all, even Christian theology had plenty to say about dreams. Joseph had M, Daniel had M, and so did Jesus. There were divine dreams, prophetic dreams, even dreams about fishing ponds, which must have been a real treat for Joseph of Arimathea. Anyway, the Bible laid out its own dream logic, so pagan dream interpreters adapted to become Christian ones. They had to keep doing what they'd always done, reading omens, guiding the anxious, helping people understand their subconscious. But now their job was to marry biblical stories and figures with the weirder elements of sleep. A talking snake in your dream might once have been Odin. Now it was St. Patrick driving out the snakes of Ireland. A visit from an old woman could be a witch, but also a holy person or a symbol of death. Yep, death still showed up in dreams, often as a skeleton. Thankfully the Valkyries were gone, but that didn't mean the dead weren't paying visits. This mix-and-match approach created a unique branch of theology, one that drew from both the Bible and local folk traditions. And it wasn't just priests or scholars who waded into this. When dreams were so closely tied to everyday life, everyone interpreted, discussed, and spread stories about dreams. It was a popular pastime and an important source of guidance in a world that felt pretty unpredictable. For example, there were collections of dream books in Old Norse, kind of like the Reader's Digest version of Norse Christianity. These books gave advice on everything from dealing with nightmares to understanding recurring themes. And they weren't just for Christians. Jewish, Muslim, and even neo-pagan dream lore found audiences in Scandinavia, blending seamlessly with local legends. One particularly juicy story comes from a book called The Hawksbay. It's filled with dreams. Some scary, some salacious, all meant to teach a lesson or titillate the readers. Take the dream of Bishop Upsalon, who saw a demon licking the genitals of a nun, not exactly subtle. Or the tale of a jealous wife who dreamed she was having sex with a tree only to find her husband cheating in the waking world. These lurid dreams offer a glimpse into people's minds and the kinds of things that kept them up at night, literally. And speaking of keeping it real, let's talk about the role dreams played in day-to-day life. Need to convince someone of something? Tell them you saw them in a dream. Want to break up with someone? Dreams were your wingman. Seriously, people use dreams as a way to communicate all sorts of messages, even if those messages were, outlandish. There was even a system, like gossip, but for dreams, where people passed around news about others' nocturnal adventures. This wasn't just idle chatter. Dreams became a way to share information, warn others, and maybe even vent a little. Plus, in a time before recording devices, people remembered their dreams to remember everything else. Officials wrote down their visions to consult later. Law courts even had special witnesses whose job it was to remember everyone's dreams. Talk about an important position. So in a nutshell, that's what happened to Viking beliefs after Christianity arrived. Dream lore mixed, matched, evolved, and endured. It didn't vanish, it adapted, integrated, and influenced. The Vikings' openness to different cultures and ideas, plus the enduring power of dreams themselves, created a melting pot of beliefs. To truly appreciate Viking culture, we need to look beyond their battles and raids. Examine the everyday aspects of their lives, including their sleep and their dreams. Next, let's get cozy with the subject of beds. You know, that thing you do every day but probably haven't given much thought to. We'll unpack the cozy science of bedding, dive into the psychology of our favorite sleep gadgets, and explore the tech trying to upgrade our shut-eye. All that and more on SCI Show Sleep, the series that explores what happens when science takes a nap.